Okay, so hello and welcome back to another Unity tutorial. In this video we're going to be continuing with the RPG systems tutorial series. In this video we're going to be moving on to do the vendor code. So last video we did the vendor UI. We'd already set up the NPC UI so that when you go up and speak to an NPC, it pops open a window saying, hi, I'm Bob, I have, I do this or whatever, so I'm a vendor, here's my inventory essentially. So when we click on the button for their vendor, what we expect to do, we expect the NPC panel to perhaps, toggle off, and then we toggle on the vendor window, and then we do some stuff there, and then when we close the vendor window, we expect that to then toggle back on the NPC window, and that'll be the same pretty much for anything we do with the NPC. Like when it's done, it will, toggle back the original thing. Once we've done this, and obviously we can move on to do a quest system or whatever other systems we decide we need to do. I've got a list of different things I'm going to do. I just don't know exactly what order to do them in. But yeah, this video is going to be focused on doing that code. It'll probably take 2 videos because there's quite a bit to do with this. We still need a way to give the player a currency, essentially. We need him to store money. For now I'm just going to store it in the inventory class, but maybe we'll put that elsewhere eventually. Also, one quick note is I've moved back to using Visual Studio from Visual Studio Code. I don't know, I'm just trying some different IDEs and seeing what I like, but for now, if you're confused why I've changed back, it's just because I felt like it. There's no particular reason. You don't have to change back. You can keep using VS Code if you want to. But yeah, let's get into the video now. But of course, first I've got to thank my patrons. A special thanks to Flow State Games, Average Morning, Art Farrell, Buddha Ray, Remy Baldwin, and Phil Baum. If anyone else is able to help support the channel monetarily, the link is down below. If you can't, then there are also links down below to my social media. If you can help me out by supporting on those, it would be greatly appreciated. Okay, so this is what we did last video. We got the buy, the sell tab, so that's going to basically display my inventory and the NPC's inventory. And then when you click on an item, we populate the text on the side to say, stuff about the item, just so you know a bit about it. And then the 10 out of 50 there is just the quantity. I know the bar isn't 10% of the way through, sorry, 20% of the way through, but you get the point. We're going to drag that slider bar where the green currently is to select how many we want to sell or buy, and then we press confirm to do the transaction, so whether that's buying or selling, and then we have to have the code handle, or do they have enough money for that, and if so, then take the money off and then add the items and so on. So that's what we're going to do this video and next video. So let's start off with the tabs to display the different items. Okay, so to do that, to have the tabs, we need to actually be able to let the vendor window essentially know what inventories are happening here, right? So we need to ideally raise an event that we want the vendor code to be completely isolated from the player and the NPC. It shouldn't really know who the player is and who the NPC is. It just needs to be told to basically start a vendor scenario with 2 different inventories. You will need to specify which is yours and which is the other person's, but that's as much as it needs to know, right? Just take in 2 item holders or whatever, 2 item containers I think we called it, and then once it's got those 2 from the event, we can then start the interaction. So we're going to need to make a new event type, and let me just open up my scripts in here. So we're going to be using the NPCs folder here pretty much, and the items. Those are the 2 really we're going to be using. So we want to make a separate class for the vendor and then an event to raise for it. So over in occupations, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a folder for the vendor stuff, right? So vendors, and we'll put the vendor in there. And then we're also going to want to make the vendor system. So the vendor is just the occupation. Then we're going to make the vendor system, which is what's going to listen for the events of start the vendor scenario with 2 things. So this is going to want some data as well that is raised from the event. Now we could make an event that passes through 2 arguments, but the thing is, if we ever want to change that, then we have to go back and change all of the event stuff. It makes sense to make a class specific for a vendor scenario and then pass the data through there. So what we'll do is we'll make a new class and then we'll raise an event with that custom class. So if we ever want to add data to this event that's passed through, we just add it to that class. It'll make it easily expandable. Okay, I can't really think of a good name for this, so I'm just going to go with, it's going to be a vendor transition or scenario, vendor scenario data. So this is just going to store simply the data on the scenario, right? So it's just going to be a class. It's not a mono behavior. Obviously, I'm going to go put it in the namespace dapperdino dot npcs dot occupations dot vendors. So all the vendor stuff is going to be inside here. Okay. And then we can actually go and move the vendor code inside here too. We just want to keep it completely separated from the rest of the code that doesn't need to know about it, right? So if I go in here, occupations, vendors, we'll go back to the vendor stuff and go occupations.vendors. So this is the vendor scenario data, just a normal class, and I don't think we need to make it serializable. We can just leave it as it is. All it's going to do is it's going to store two different, so we're going to have a private, what are we going to have, right? We're going to have the vendor that is the buying one and the selling one, right? So we're going to have like the buying, it's going to be an item container, right? item container, which we're going to need to import items for. And then we're going to say the first one is going to be the buying item container, like so, right? And then we're going to have a selling item container. Oops. A selling item container. Currently, that's all we're really going to pass through. I mean, obviously, as I said, if we need to add more data, we'll do it here. And we want to make a constructor for this, right? So we're going to say public vendor scenario data. We want to take in an item container, buying item container, and an item container, selling item container. Okay. Now, I mean, I could put this off the screen. It depends how far it goes. See, I don't think it looks that great like that. So let's just do it like this. So we take in two of these, and we're just going to say this dot buying item container is buying item container. This dot selling is selling. And then at the bottom here, now that we've done all that setting up, all we want to do is we want to be able to access those as getters, but not setters. The vendor shouldn't be able to set them. As in, like, the vendor system shouldn't set them, it should only receive them. So I'm going to say public item container. And I'm just going to copy this, but put a capital B instead, so it's a getter. And it's going to return the private field buying item container. Now this will probably tell us you can use an auto property again. So actually, that makes more sense. It'll, result in less code. So what it's doing here is it's saying it's just a getter. The reason we don't have to put private set is actually just because constructors don't count as it's weird. Basically, you can put private set if you want to, but you don't need to. It doesn't make sense to really. So I'm just gonna paste that as well. Put selling item container, and then we can just get rid of that field up here. And now it's even telling us you don't need to use this dot because they're not even spelt the same anymore. So make sure that's capital S. And everyone's happy now. Okay, so here's the data. We can get rid of these unneeded fields. So now we can simply say new vendor scenario data, pass through the two vendors, and then send that off in an event. And then the thing that receives it can access who's buying and who's selling, right? That's all the vendor system needs to know. So let's move on from there. So here in the vendor system, we're going to want to have a function for starting a scenario, essentially. So public void start scenario, or something like that. And that's going to need to take in some vendor. Okay, it's not going to pop up because we're not in the right namespace. We could also have a using and put it in a different namespace, but it makes sense to put it in the same one. It'd be stupid not to. So dapperdino.npcs.occupations.vendors, and now in here we have access to all the vendor related stuff. So it will, if I have the right amount of, oh, it's because I haven't put the thing on the end. So yeah, in here we're going to need to say vendor scenario data, just call it scenario data or something. And now we want to put the code in here for what to do, but obviously we can access scenario data dot buying item container, selling item container. So the system is just going to listen for an event that passes through some scenario data, and it's going to do stuff with it, such as populating the UI and all that lot. That's going to all happen in here, right? It even makes sense probably to store it privately here so that we can access it in other functions, but we'll think about that in a second when we get around to it. First, I want to just have the event raised, and I'll put a debug in here for when we do it. Debug.log scenario data dot buying item container dot name or something, Or I don't think, no, we can't do name because it's an interface. But let's just say debug.log scenario started. Okay. Now we can move on to doing the events. Okay, so we've done this plenty of times in the past. All you're going to want to do is go through here and add events that have the vendor scenario data event. Now, I feel like it's too long of a name for this, really. Because if we have like Unity vendor scenario data event, it's going to be like a huge name. So we're just going to rename it, really. I'm just going to call it vendor data for now. Really, that's all I'm going to call it. I know it seems a bit silly having like vendor and vendor data, because you'd think, oh, it's the data about the vendor. So we could even just call it scenario data, but have it in the vendor namespace. There's so many ways you could do this. I'm just going to call it vendor data. Like so. So if you use F2 to rename it, then it renames it everywhere else. Just make sure you also rename the file. That's one thing that doesn't happen on rename. So vendor data. If we think of a better name down the line, or you guys think of a name I'm obviously missing, just go put that in the comments below. It'd be quite helpful. I'll rename it in the project. But now we can start making these events. So just as we've done in the past, you just copy and paste one we've already got, and then call it vendor data event. And in here we want to take in vendor data. So we're going to copy that, paste that there. Game events, vendor data event, new vendor data event. It doesn't know what that is, so then we add the using, get rid of the old one, and then this script's happy. So go through and do that for the listeners and Unity events. If you're following along with this project, you'll obviously have these already. So just go make some. I'm going to just cut ahead until I've done that. Okay, I've done, so it should all be happy. We've got the Unity event here. We've got the listener here. It's all happy. It's all happy. If you need any help with this, obviously, down below I've got a link to my GitHub where after I've done this, I'll push it to there and you'll see all the changes. If you ever get this compiler error that sometimes happens, I'll just take off a semicolon, save, and then add the semicolon back and save, or something like that. It just basically needs to recompile. Sometimes it's a bit odd. Now it's happy. Everything is good to go. So we need to now make one of those events and raise it from somewhere. So where are we going to raise it from? Well, we're obviously going to raise it from the vendor occupation. Currently, we just debug names of items and stuff. That's silly. We don't need to do that, obviously. So if we look here, vendor, we have our own item container, right? Obviously, we have the item container of the thing. Now, let's just imagine this vendor system doesn't know there's a player and an NPC. As far as it's aware, two NPCs could trade, right? If you can set it up so two NPCs can trade. All it cares about is who is buying and who is selling in this scenario, right? So in reality, what we need to do here is we already have access to our own item container as a vendor, right? I am an NPC, I have an inventory or an item container, whatever. But we need to get the players. Now, as far as we're aware, the player is just the person that's interacting with us, okay? So obviously, this is just an IOccupation that we trigger from the vendor, from the NPC. So if I click on NPC, we're just going to call, we call trigger from here. Occupation button, we trigger the occupation. We're going to need some way to get reference to the person who's triggering us, right? Who's interacting with us when we call trigger, the other person, right? So we need to essentially get this from the NPC, which is, you see the NPC is a, here, look here. OnStartInteraction.raise this, that's what will populate the NPC UI, right? We get the NPC, we spawn all these occupation buttons, and we initialize the buttons with the NPC's occupation. Ideally, as well as the occupation, we'll pass through the person we're interacting with. There's two ways to do that. We can either add another field here when we set the NPC and then mess with the other events and so on and add two fields, and it'll be a mess. Ideally, all we need to do really is just go to the NPC class, which you already have, and store privately the thing we're interacting with, right? And then we can access that from the thing over here, which has access to the NPC. What I mean by that is, when we interact, we're going to make this a block body, and before we raise the event, we want to have a private field for, maybe we could make it a game object. I mean, it doesn't really matter that much. I think it makes sense to be a game object. So let's have a, where should we put it? Oh, there's private field, put it here. Private game object other or something, right? It's going to be the other thing that we're interacting with as an NPC. So like other interact or something, right? We get the game object through here. So we're going to set that to null by default. And when we interact, we're going to say other interactor is equal to other. So now if I write a getter, so if I go down to here and write public game object other interactor returns other interactor, we're going to get another auto property thing here we can do. So let's just do that, why not? Yeah, again, it's something we can get access to, but we set privately. We set other interactor. Now, in the vendor system, not the vendor system, where are we? The NPC UI, we initialize the button. The occupation button should now have access to, what does it do? When we trigger, we currently don't pass any data through, right? No data, but we want to ideally pass through a game object, right? So we're going to pass through a game object called other. And by doing that, we're going to make some other code unhappy. Over here, it says this occupation doesn't take through a game object, so game object other. And obviously from having other here, we can then say we want to raise an event saying, start a vendor thing, but only if the other has an item container, right? We don't want to start a window if the player itself doesn't even have an item container, right? That'd be pretty silly. So we're going to say, we're going to say var item, var other item container is equal to other.get component item container, right? So we're going to store that, and then we're going to say if the other item container is null, return. We're just going to not do anything, right? If if the person, the player, or whatever it is the NPC is talking to doesn't have an item container, then we don't even want to start a vendor scenario, right? But if they do, then we're going to say we want to raise an event essentially from here. We want to say at the top, we want to say serialize field private reference to vendor data event on start vendor scenario. We'll go with that. Alright. And we want to raise that from down here. So we want to say on start vendor scenario dot raise. What does it take in? It takes in some vendor data. So we want to say new vendor data. And we want to populate all the data here. Now, I mean, to be honest, I prefer to do it like this. I prefer saying vendor data is equal to new vendor data, and we have to pass in the datas, right? So the item container who is buying and the one who is selling. So the buying is the player, right? Or it's not really buying necessarily, because obviously they can sell too. But what I mean is the buying is actually the buying is the player one, definitely. So other item container, and then the selling one is me, item container, because I am the vendor. And then we can just pass that through into the event, and we pass that data off to whoever it is that listens, which in this case is the vendor UI. So that's all set up. I'm going to remove that, we don't need that. If I go back, who's not happy now? We need to trigger and pass through other. We don't have other here, right? The button needs to be initialized with other. So what we can do is, instead of, we take through an occupation currently, ideally we can just initialize it with an NPC and then set the stuff. So if we make this a block body and take through an NPC, actually no, because we need to know which occupation we have. So sorry, occupation, and we also want pass through other, right? So we'll say game object other. Private game object other equals null. This dot other is equal to other. And then we pass that through there. Now that's happy. Someone else is probably going to be unhappy. You just got to keep, basically, when you add functionality on higher level, you've then got to filter it through lower, if you get what I mean. We have to like pass it all through. So now finally, this is where we have the data and we need to pass it in. We're going to say pass in npc.other interactor. And all the code should be happy at last. It is happy. Let's hide the vendor canvas thing. So let's go quickly make the event. So game events, NPC. I'm gonna put vendor in a separate folder. I mean, actually, I'll put it inside NPC. Makes sense. Inside vendor, we're gonna have a new game event, vendor data event, and we're gonna call it game event underscore NPC underscore vendor underscore on vendor scenario start. And all we're going to do now is tell the vendor UI to listen for a vendor data. We're also going to add the vendor system to it. Let me just apply all and go into the prefab to edit it. It's easier to do it through the prefab. So we want to listen for an event, which is the one we just made. When we get it, we want to tell the vendor system to start a scenario. Remember, it's the dynamic function up at the top because we're passing through data dynamically. And then what else do we want to do? Well, we probably want to enable. We want to enable the canvas for it. I'd say, should we do this through code or through here? I think it makes sense to do it through here. So we say canvas, game object, set active, true, when we start the thingy. And I mean, I'll find a better way to do it probably, but for now I'm going to just drag in the canvas for the NPC. Whoops. I'm going to drag in the NPC canvas and toggle it off just as a quick way to check if this is working. If we go back to the NPC itself, the one with the vendor stuff, you notice now how it says vendor data event. Now we don't want to have to set this per NPC. What we can actually do is go to the vendor script, and we know this event is going to be the same for them all, so you can actually set it on the script. It'll compile, saving those default values. Now, technically, because this NPC was already in the scene, we have to, if we press reset, it actually does it for you, puts it back in. So now we're going to change these. We're going to open his vendor thing. It's going to trigger this event. It's going to say on vendor scenario started. This UI is going to trigger, and then we're going to call the debug thing in the vendor system saying, where is it? Scenario started. That is the goal. Let's see if it works. I'm going to walk over to him. Let's trade. Boom. Iron Sword. Obviously, this hasn't been updated yet, but you see how it says scenario started, and we toggled this on. Now, the close button for this does close itself. Ideally, when it closes, it then goes back to the NPC UI, so we can set that up stuff. We can set that stuff up next time. To end this video off, I just want to perhaps populate the buttons with like what they are, if you get what I mean. So if we go back here into our prefabs, did we make a vendor slot? No, we didn't. A slot inventory slot hotbar. Oh, we did. We made a button vendor item. We didn't put any code on it. We just made it, didn't we? Yeah. Cool. All right, let's get to that real quick. So by default, the vendor system is going to be in buy mode, and buy mode is going to show you the vendor's inventory. So I feel like we'll do the selling thing next episode and filling up this UI. But what I just want to do now is essentially when we open the vendor UI, just make a button for each of their items and how many they have. Right? That's the ideal thing right now. We don't even have to press the buy button. It should be on buy by default, right? So we want to have a reference to this transform that holds where the buttons are, right? So serialize field, private transform, we'll call it button holder transform. And when we start scenario, for now, all we want to do, this is going to be abstracted into different functions. We're just going to say for in I is 0, while I is less than scenario data dot the selling item containers. How about we in reality we want to get all their items, so let's just get an array of items. Maybe how are we going to do this? All we want to do is we want to go through their inventory. Let's go to selling item container. Currently we have list of item get all items. Okay, we're just going to say currently get all items. I'm going to put that here. So we want a var items equals that, while I is less than items dot count I plus plus. This code can definitely be refactored to be better. Like, I know the way I'm doing it now isn't the best, but we want to spawn in a button for each. So we're going to say let's have a prefab for the button prefab. Okay. We're going to say instantiate the button prefab as a child of the button holder transform, like so. And we want to then say game object button instance is equal to that. Make sure you've got your semicolon on the end. All we need to do now is initialize the button script, which we haven't written yet. So that's just going to populate the UI. That's all we're going to do. We're going to set an icon and set some text, okay? Okay, because we're running a bit short on the video, I just decided to quickly write this class on my own just to save like a minute or so. So all you see here is just a vendor button. We need to reference in the UI the text and the image component, and then we just take in an item and a quantity and set it there. Now this will probably be refactored too, but it works for now, where you need to tell the button button instance dot get component vendor item button dot initialize, and we need to tell it an item and a quantity. So all we need to do is we need to say items I, and then the quantity is going to be the scenario data dot selling get total quantity of an item, which is items I. Now that's obviously a big mess. Wait, get total quantity. We need to tell it an inventory item, and as far as it's aware, it's not an inventory item if it's okay. So get all items should actually be a list of inventory items. Is everyone happy with that? Put a semicolon on the end, even though it's a mess. I'm actually just going to make this easy for you guys to read by just moving it down like this. This is just a temporary thing to make it work quickly. Apparently this doesn't implement it properly. So if we go down, up even. Get all items should be a list of inventory item, which is fine. Now everyone truly is happy. On the vendor item button, we want to end the vendor item button class and drag in the icon and the name, and then back out of there. And on the vendor UI, it's asking us now for the button prefab. So if we just go back to, if I lock this, go back to prefabs, vendor item button, and then the transform is on the vendor UI, scroll rect items, background items, holder items. Okay, I just had a little problem with the prefab system. For some reason, whenever I toggled the canvas, it also toggled the root object, so I just had to restart and it worked fine. So let's test it now. I know it's not going to be fully working, there are some things to fix, but if we walk up to him, interact, let's trade, we get this window. The buy and the sell button obviously don't do anything, but we now see the items they have. The only problem is we don't want to see the same item 3 times. We only want to see so he has obviously 3 health potions with 3 in each stack. So it's saying there's 9 health potions, but it shows each one 3 times. So in the next video, we're going to move on and do some changes where we make it so that we can access each individual item and only spawn 1 per item. So if we have 5 different health potions, well, no, 5 of the same health potion in different places, we only want 1 button telling us the total quantity of health potions. And obviously, if we had loads of stuff we could scroll, then we want to be able to drag this, confirm. So when we drag this, we expect it to update that, and when we click on items, we expect it to update that. So there's still quite a few things to do. So this might even be a 3-part video, but once we're done, we'll have a really flexible vendor UI system, and it'll work pretty well, I think. I think we're making good progress so far. Hope you guys enjoy the series. If you are enjoying it, then feel free to help me out below. Everything will be greatly appreciated. Tune into my streams every 2 days. Except next week, I'm actually going to be away, so that's going to be. I'm still going to be uploading videos like normal, but I won't be able to stream because obviously I'm away. Then the week after that is the Brackeys Game Jam. I know it's not just Brackeys, there's also Danny, Saiku, Blackthorn Prods, quite a few big Unity YouTubers doing a big game jam. That week there'll be no videos, I'm just going to be streaming every day the game jam process for that week, and that's at the end of the month. So yeah, hope you stay tuned with everything. Join our Discord server if you want to be alerted of all this stuff. But apart from that, thanks for watching guys, see you in the next video, peace.